This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, and this is episode 639 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, sponsored by FanDuel. Thanks for tuning in. I build projections every year, but I don't use projections the way some of you probably think. To me, projections are a guide. They're a way for you to get a better understanding of situation, and they're a way for you to spot really glaring misprices in the market. But there's a lot of variance in fantasy football. Projections provide you with the most likely outcome for a player, but they don't capture the range of outcomes very well. And some players' range of outcomes are a lot greater than others based on the information that we have. I don't build projections to plug into a value over replacement level formula for my drafts. It's not unhelpful to do that, but I go through the exercise of building projections because, like I said, you can really learn a lot about player situations by doing that. I do this episode every year. In April, I build out my projections. Then players get drafted during the NFL draft, and I modify them. And then here in May, I talk about some of the things that were interesting and that I jotted down while these stat lines were being created, while I was building projections. My plan is to share some of those insights today. Before doing that, though, sports fans, there's no better time than today to sign up for FanDuel Fantasy. For users who have yet to make a deposit on FanDuel Fantasy, you can deposit today to receive 2 free entries. All you have to do is deposit a minimum of $10 into your FanDuel DFS account, and you'll be instantly rewarded with 2 free vouchers. It's a limited time offer, so be sure to deposit now and play for free. Head over to FanDuel.com or download the FanDuel Fantasy app today. Eligibility restrictions apply. Go to FanDuel.com or download the FanDuel app for more details. Let's talk about Deebo Samuel, because he's polarizing, and my projections don't like him as much as the consensus does. As it stands today, Deebo is the wide receiver 11 in PPR formats according to my projections. He's getting selected at wide receiver 7, though, in early best ball drafts. That may not seem significant, but when we're talking about the early rounds, it's pretty significant. The opportunity cost is pretty high. Deebo's season last year was a tale of 2 halves. During his first 8 games, he averages 1 rush attempt per contest, and he was averaging 20.7 PPR points per game during that stretch. During his final 8 games, those rushing numbers rose to 6.6 rush attempts per game, and his point per game total jumped by a full point. I think there's this belief that Samuel was only a true fantasy stud when he was seeing work on the ground last year. And that's not really true. He was dominant during the front half of 2021. He was averaging over a 33% target share per game. That's part of the problem with Deebo's projection for 2022, at least part of it. Is he going to continue seeing the kind of work on the ground that he was seeing down the stretch last year? Now, this is purely speculation on my part, but the issues that he's having with San Francisco right now, there's a chance it has to do with that fact. That he either wants a ton of money or he doesn't want to be used the way that he was used last year, because that's going to likely shorten his career. And I wouldn't blame him for that at all. Now, even if he maintains the rush attempts that he was seeing last year, it's hard to imagine a scenario where he's keeping up the touchdown production. He scored 8 rushing touchdowns on 59 attempts last year. Now, he's Deebo Samuel. He's a beast. I'm not discounting that. But a rushing touchdown in every 7.4 rush attempts is still out of this world efficient. Not that this is an apples to apples comparison, but since 2011, wide receivers have scored touchdowns on average on every 28 rush attempts. Samuel was almost 4 times as efficient as that. So then we jump to the target share problem. He dominated looks in that San Francisco offense last year, especially during the front half of the season, like I said. We shouldn't forget, though, that George Kittle was a little bit banged up during that time, and Brandon Ayuk was not getting starter snaps. He wasn't quite there, despite what he did as a rookie. Deebo can hit a high target share. That's not what I'm arguing or saying here. My argument is that he's very unlikely to hit the kind of share that he was seeing when he dominated fantasy football without the rushing production. You've got to look at the team level here, too. Trey Lance is a big deal. Now, Deebo's splits last year with and without Trey Lance show that he was below his average with Lance playing, but there's a lot of noise to that. The bigger picture is what's more important. And as I talked through on episode 510 last year, mobile quarterbacks are rarely a good thing for their teammates. And it makes sense. They gobble up a larger share of their offense for themselves. Not only that, but San Francisco likes to run the football, and that's reinforced when you've got a mobile quarterback. That can then limit receiving volume. It's not that I dislike Deebo. I love Deebo Samuel, the player. He's amazing. But I do think that you can make the argument right now that he's being a little bit overdrafted. And his projection shows that. Now, I'm going to go from a controversial topic to one that absolutely no one cares about or is talking about. But I have to at least say it because it jumped out to me. Daniel Jones looks good in my projections. I mean, maybe not good, but he looks way better than I expected. Jones runs the risk of potentially not even starting the whole year if things go bad. And I'm definitely not advocating you draft him as your starter. There's no need to do that. But let's dig into this. The Giants sucked last year on offense. Like, they were just terrible. They only scored 23 offensive touchdowns or 1.35 touchdowns per game. That was the 7th lowest per game average since 2011. And since 2011, 18 teams averaged 1.5 offensive touchdowns per game or less. Remember, the Giants were at 1.35. So they're part of that group, as was Jacksonville last year. That gives us 16 teams to hit that low of a mark with next season data. Among those 16, only one of them saw a drop in touchdowns year over year, and that drop was by 1 total touchdown. On average, those teams saw an increase of 0.82 touchdowns per game, which across a 17-game season equates to almost 14 touchdowns. The picture I'm trying to paint here is that it's going to be incredibly difficult for the Giants to be as bad as they were last year offensively. I just shared touchdown numbers with you, but you could look at something like yards per play too. And that's just based on what we naturally see happen year over year with teams. Bad teams make changes, and those changes often result in better numbers. That's what we've got with the Giants. Brian Daboll's in town. Not to say that Daniel Jones is going to be Josh Allen, because he likely will not be Josh Allen, but Daboll was Josh Allen's offensive coordinator when he made the jump. That certainly can't hurt the Daniel Jones argument. And Jones himself, not that bad last year, all things considered. He ranked 17th in points per game last year among quarterbacks with 8 or more games played. He averaged as many points per game as Derek Carr did. And that was on fewer than 1 passing touchdown per contest. The Giants don't have bad weapons. They also don't have Jason Garrett anymore. Daniel Jones makes a ton of sense as a QB3 in Superflex or best ball formats this year if his price holds. Michael Pittman might be the most undervalued potential stud in fantasy football. A lot of people in early best ball drafts seem to realize that, but there are a lot of casual fantasy players out there who probably don't realize that as a second-year player last season, Pittman was pretty good. He was a low-end wide receiver 2 in PPR points per game, and most importantly, he saw a target share of almost 26%. He's moved exactly as you'd like to see a player move from year 1 to year 2. He dealt with some injury issues as a rookie, but on a per-game basis, his target share was still in that 14% range. And then we saw the breakout happen to some degree last year with his 26% target share. You may be wondering why Pittman wasn't even better last season. Part of the reason is because the Colts were so run-heavy. They had a pass-to-rush attempt ratio that was barely above 1 last season, meaning they passed it just a tiny bit more than they ran it. They were 28th in football in pass rate. But when in neutral game scripts, that number jumped to 17th. And that's actually more predictive, that number is, to next season pass rate. So the Colts with Matt Ryan could see more volume through the air. And even if they don't, even if they continue with their pass rate, Pittman should still be able to hit strong numbers in his 3rd year. The Colts didn't do that much at pass catcher this offseason. At least that could really hurt Pittman in redraft. Pittman seems like a pretty safe option, and my projections are quite bullish on him. Now, speaking of passing volume, let's have a chat about the Baltimore Ravens. A lot happened last year for Baltimore that helped guide them to a more pass-heavy approach. They lost their running backs. Their defense was really banged up. They drafted Rashad Bateman. In turn, the Ravens were 23rd in pass rate. That's far different than what we've seen from the other 2 seasons in this Lamar Jackson era. I think that alone tells us that they're probably not going to be as pass-heavy this season. But what really compounded and helped the passing attack in 2021 was the number of plays that they ran. Baltimore was 23rd in pass rate, but they were 9th in pass attempts. And it's because they ran by far the most plays in the league. They're running a lot of plays, so even though their pass rate was low, volume both in rushing and passing was pretty strong. They were 9th in pass attempts, like I just said. They were 3rd in rush attempts. To give you guys some context, Baltimore's year-over-year plays per game rate increased by the 6th highest amount since 2011. And since that point in time, Baltimore's plays per game last year was 11th highest. You probably know where I'm taking this. If you look at the top 20 seasons since 2011 in plays per game, assuming we've got next season data, 0 of those teams ran more plays the following year. None. And the average drop in plays run was 4 per game. Meaning we should probably expect Baltimore to run about 4 fewer plays per game. Which makes some sense because that's close to their average with Lamar Jackson in the 2 years prior to last season. 4 plays per game is not some insignificant number. It can have enough of an impact to make you not want to buy into the team's pass catchers as much. Now, I still like Rashad Bateman. I still like Mark Andrews. Andrews is still my tight end 2 in redraft. He's still fine. He's still going to ball out. But it does mean that those players need higher target shares than they did last season in order to perform the way that they did last year. All else being equal. At least Andrews. Bateman's a little bit different of a case. But with Baltimore, it's definitely something to keep in mind because they could get more conservative again with the defense and the running back room being healthier. Now that all leads me to Hollywood Brown. With the Ravens pass catchers, I think it more so hurts the secondary options in that offense rather than Mark Andrews and Rashad Bateman, since both of them have an opportunity to really capture a large target share in that offense. But the Marquise Brown situation is really interesting to me. As we know, a lot of managers draft off of what happened the previous season, and that previous season production is not irrelevant. With Brown, he's coming off a year with 145 targets and a bottom half wide receiver 2 performance in PPR points per game. Now he's going to Arizona to play with Kyler Murray. It can only get better, right? Well, he's being drafted as a top 20 wide receiver. I don't want to make this episode about how I really view these guys versus the market, but it's kind of impossible to find interesting things with projections without comparing those projections to how people are drafting players. And right now in best ball drafts, Brown goes as a top 20 wideout. Even with the DeAndre Hopkins suspension, my projections don't see it. In 2021, Marquise Brown saw 24.5% of Baltimore's targets. On a per game basis, because he played 16 games and not 17, that's over a 26% target share. That's a very high number. And it's one that came within an offense that I just talked about that ran a lot of plays. Last season, Baltimore actually had more pass attempts than Arizona did. Baltimore ranked 9th with 611. Arizona was 18th with 591. According to Pro Football Focus's expected fantasy point statistic, Brown did play a couple of points per game below expectation last year. So he has some room for growth. And maybe that's why people are bullish. But this is a really good example of what I talked about on the Mailbag show this past week. Favorable regression doesn't mean you automatically target a player in your fantasy draft. It doesn't automatically mean the player is going to be better. Because Brown's in a new offense with new competition. He should lead that team in targets this year now that Hopkins is suspended. But you can't just lock him into a 26% target share like you saw with the Ravens last year. And remember, that was on a team that threw the ball more last year than Arizona did. That allowed for more overall volume. It's not that I think Brown is bad, but he's closer to wide receiver 30 in my projections than he is wide receiver 20. And that means the projections see him as overvalued. One thing that projections can be useful for is seeing where there's a drop in tier. If you go from one player to another and look at the player's point per game projection, when there's a big drop, that's when you know that there's a potential tier break. At running back, that initial tier break is pretty clear. I've got Jonathan Taylor and Christian McCaffrey in their own tier at the top, or my projections do. And then at wide receiver, it's another 2 players. And you could argue that those 2 players at wide receiver have a bigger edge over their position than Taylor and McCaffrey have. But it's Cooper Kupp and Justin Jefferson. Tight end is a little bit trickier. The projections do have Travis Kelce as the tight end 1, and then Mark Andrews as the tight end 2. Then Kyle Pitts, George Kittle, and Darren Waller. But the point projections seem kind of scrunched together, meaning that edge at tight end doesn't look as promising as it's looked over the last few seasons. We saw that a little bit last year, but this high-level look could be the start of focusing more on a later round tight end approach this year. I don't want to definitively say that, but my projections seem to be calling for that. And I wanted to give it a shout out on this episode. Now, the last thing I want to mention surrounds the Bengals and specifically Joe Burrow. When I did these initial projections, I noticed that Jamar Chase was a top 5 wide receiver, but he wasn't really in that top tier of wide receivers with Kupp and Jefferson. I don't think that's much of a take though. And T. Higgins looks fine versus ADP too. So where Chase and Higgins are getting drafted makes sense, makes enough sense to me. But then there's Joe Burrow. In early best ball drafts, Burrow's the QB 6 off the board. He's the QB 12 in my projections. That was one of the most glaring things that I noticed at the quarterback position. Why does there seem to be such a difference there? What are my projections seeing? Well, let's first realize that Burrow finished as QB 10 last year in points per game. We shouldn't just use previous season finishes to justify ranking a player in a certain spot the following year, but it's good context to just generally have. It's not like Burrow was QB 3 and my projections now all of a sudden see him as QB 12. Usually I can pinpoint something and just say, this is what the projections are seeing that the market is not seeing. Like at quarterback, I could usually just pinpoint touchdown rate because that's something that regresses year over year. And while a 6.5% touchdown rate for Burrow may be tough to repeat, that's just part of it. There seem to be a lot of smaller things that could just slightly regress for Burrow this year. Like that touchdown rate or like his yards per attempt rate that was 10th best since the turn of the century. It's a lot of those things. I understand he has great weapons. It doesn't mean sustaining those lofty numbers is easy though. And for the most part, those Cincinnati weapons stayed relatively healthy last year. There's also some slightly different competition for Burrow at quarterback this year. Russell Wilson's now in Denver. Jalen Hurts has better weapons. I mean, honestly, someone like Jalen Hurts has way more potential to break fantasy football this year than Joe Burrow does. Hurts is QB4 in my projections, but he's often being drafted after Burrow. I do think, though, that should correct itself as we move through the summer and closer to the season. So Burrow right now seems very overrated based on my projections. And since he's a popular player for good reason, I felt like that was a necessary thing to call out. But that's it. Those are some of the more interesting things that I noticed when creating projections this year. And by the way, if you're curious about the projection building process a little bit more, I actually did an episode on that very topic a couple of years ago. It's episode 373. That should help you wrap your head around things even more. But that's going to do it for today's show. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've yet subscribed to the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter at LateRoundQB. As a reminder, the Late Round Draft Guide is available for pre-order right now over on lateround.com. It's a season-long guide that launches on July 1st, and it digs into a lot of the strategic concepts that I talk about on this show. And then on top of that, I'll have the typical stuff like favorite values, favorite late-round dart throws, and more. It'll be updated and sent to your email inbox every single week once it launches. So check it out, pre-order it now for $19.99 before it jumps to $24.99 in July. But thanks everyone. I'll talk to you later in the week with the Mailbag Show.